The level of trust I have on my community mates is over the top. And I remember my daughter's now grown, but she was, 6 or 7, and she didn't want to go. I had to go grocery shopping. She didn't want to go with me. And I said, okay, nobody's home. Yeah, you can stay home. Here's what you need to know, Jesse. If you need anything, you can go to any one of these 11 neighbors around us, and they'll be there for you. And I felt as a mom, that's a big deal to feel that in your heart, that I know any of these neighbors would step in there and do what needed to be done, whatever she was hitting up against. Maybe she just needed something to eat, or maybe there was an emergency, right? Mm. So to live in a neighborhood where you feel that way is a pretty amazing thing. And it definitely makes you feel a lot less sort of, scared of the world.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on this episode, I'm joined by architect and developer Katie McCamant, who coined the term cohousing and has been instrumental in bringing this intentional community design to the U.S. There was an article that I read a while back that stopped me in my tracks. It was about the pandemic that we have been experiencing and the health implications that have come with it. But the thing is, the pandemic the article was talking about wasn't about COVID. No, this was about loneliness. You see, neuroscience and psychology researchers have found that loneliness is at an all-time high in our society. And this was even before the COVID-19 pandemic caused massive shutdowns and imposed stay-at-home orders. In studies conducted at Brigham Young University, researchers found that loneliness has the same health implications on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being an alcoholic. Loneliness, they claim, even exceeds the health risk associated with obesity. And this is crazy to me. At a time when the planet has a staggering 8 billion people, and with the technology to connect us all, we are more isolated than ever. But as crazy as it may seem, I can't help but see this as a symptom of how we have designed our homes and our communities. While many sustainability advocates are looking at ways to decarbonize the built environment, we should also be looking at ways to increase our social connection. Because if we don't, then we can expect to see more increases of dementia, anxiety, depression, and heart disease, all of which are symptoms of loneliness. I was excited to have Katie on the show because over the last 30 years, she has been one of the top leading advocates for a community-based design concept that she termed cohousing after living and studying in Denmark. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the term, cohousing is a type of intentional community where private homes are clustered around shared spaces that typically feature amenities such as a common house where you can find things like a large kitchen and a dining area, laundry, and recreational spaces, as well as shared outdoor spaces with gardens, green space, or playgrounds. Neighbors also share resources like tools and lawnmowers. This kind of intentional neighboring is extended to activities that make up the DNA of communities, such as regularly scheduled meals, meetings, and work parties. This design typically makes it easy to form relationships and organize child and elder care. In this episode, we get into Katie's background and the benefits that cohousing has had on her life and where she sees a big opportunity for cohousing to play a more prominent role in U.S. housing developments. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another podcast episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I'm really excited today because we have Katie McCamant on, and I want to introduce you through this way because we don't get too many people, Katie, that have introduced a term that now I think a lot of people know, but co-housing is the term, and it's also it's funny because it gets used in a couple different ways. So I think the best way to ground in this conversation is like, let's talk about what co-housing is and get straight on our definition so that then we can go wherever we want to go after that.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Neil. Yeah, I'm part of the couple that invented the term co-housing. And we did that when we were doing our initial investigations in this housing model in Denmark. And the Danish Housing Research Institute called and said, "So what are you guys going to call it in English?" And it was clear that the Danish term, bofællesskaber, wasn't really going to catch on.
And what does that mean in Danish?
It means living communities.
Mm.
So we played with a bunch and we came up with co-housing. And so, yeah, and it is actually in the English Oxford Dictionary. And Catherine McCamant and Charles Durrett are given credit for inventing the term. So my claim to fame.
That's a great success story just from that. But I've seen people use it interchangeably with like co-living and all this other stuff where that's why I think it's really good to be like, no, let's talk about co-housing, what the originator of the term really means whenever she talks co-housing.
Yes, and I spent a lot of time on this. So yeah, there's a broad range of types of communities, but co-housing is one specific model of community. And the basic definition of co-housing is that you have individual private homes with a kitchen, right? So that could be a studio apartment, it could be a 4-bedroom, standalone, single-family house, but you have your own individual home plus extensive common facilities that you share with your neighbors, and that the residents are involved in the design and development process. So in that way, it's really a custom neighborhood, not a custom house. We often emphasize it's not a custom house, but a custom neighborhood. And I think the importance of the resident involvement, and it's not to be interpreted that residents are better designers than architects, because I actually think people often get confused about that. I think my view is that really the best models are when you really take advantage of strong professionals with a group of future residents. But I think when you're actually talking to the people who are going to live there, and particularly if they're buyers, so they're putting their money in, you can have an in-depth discussion about the priorities in a way you can't otherwise. You know, what's more important to you? Are you willing to walk this far from your car? Are you willing to give up space in your private home to have more common facilities? And so I think that's where the shift really happens, is when you can move things forward in a more sustainable way because you have buy-in from the people who are ultimately going to be living in there for the long term. So that's the importance of the resident involvement. So, but you can have a shared house within a co-housing community, but a shared house or a co-living situation is just a much more intense sharing of the kitchen. And particularly for affordability, that's a really important model. But I think it's a different model, and it has different levels of intimacy. So that's really the model of co-housing is that you have your own private home, whatever size that might be. And then that gives you more flexibility of how you interact with the community. And I think is more sustainable over the long term for many people.
So how does a community member design the neighborhood? What does that look like? Where does the co part come from?
Yeah, well, the first thing, and I think it's not necessarily the way I would hope it was going, but you know, there are 180 existing co-housing communities across the United States now. And the large, overwhelming majority of those were initiated by people who wanted to live in those communities. They were not initiated by developers. Now, I've initiated new communities that I didn't live in as a developer. And I think we actually have a really good model for doing that. But the development world is still really shied away from that. So I think there is a really strong model for partnership between the people who know they want to live in a different way, and they're not finding those neighborhoods out there that they can just buy into. And so at some point they say, okay, well, how do we do this? And that's when I get a call, right? And so, but I think that there's this middle ground that a lot of people don't appreciate, where you're really taking the best of your professionals and combining that with the future residents and the buyers and what's important to them. And so it's not a, well, what do you want? It's a pretty strongly facilitated design process. And I found that, people have very little patience for a lot of airy-fairy discussion about things that ultimately they can't do or doesn't make a difference, right? So my questions, like one of my first questions for a co-housing group is like, so you need mortgages, right? If you need bank financing, that determines a lot about how this is put together. We got to be building codes, right? So there's all this sort of outside that your average co-housing buyer doesn't know. I mean, they're not a development professional. They're not architects, and they may have been dreaming, but they don't know those things. So the professionals really need to bring and focus a design process and really focus the decisions and trade-offs on where we actually have real choices. And I actually think probably the thing that makes the biggest difference is the site plan. It's not the countertops, it's the site plan. That's what changes how we know our neighbors. And so how you facilitate that process is a combination of education. It takes, here's, things we know. And now here's the choices. What does your group want to do? And so a strongly facilitated process that doesn't let people kind of out there wander around in the forest and then find out they can't afford it or can't get it through building code. And I am an architect, but I'm no longer practicing as an architect. So now I help work with other architects to help facilitate that process. And same with the development process. The other thing is, bottom line, we shouldn't talk about anything if it's not directly tied to how much it costs, right? Because you can have a lot of great ideas, but if you can't afford them, then we might as well not talk about them. So that's sort of my approach, is really honing in on, I don't want to dream. I don't want to talk. I don't want to do just potlucks. I want to build more sustainable communities. I want actual built physical communities that will go on 100 years after I'm gone. And so I'm very focused on what do we need to do to get this built.
Well, I think that's a good jumping off point, because we're coming out of this crazy global experience where what we see from a real estate side is people, they're tapping into something that is innate to us, that they're craving community and they want community. They have no idea what that actually looks like, because we've grown up in a society that has gone in a different direction. Let's put it that way. But how can we go back, and pick it up wherever you think it's appropriate, of what called you towards this, towards orienting your professional and your personal life towards co-housing, and how do you develop that field so we can really get a sense of what is the state of affairs today? I mean, how did we get to 180 existing communities? But really, because you are very action oriented, and we want to be able to build more of these communities, and we want to maybe even retrofit existing communities to bend towards what a co-housing community can look like. Let's talk about the future, but I think the best way to get there is by looking backwards.
Yes. Well, so how I got introduced into co-housing is I really wanted to study in Europe, and I got myself into an architecture program in Copenhagen. And if you study architecture in Denmark, you study the history of housing in Denmark, because they really have a very deliberate process and evolution there. And so that's where I was introduced to co-housing. And I was actually very young in my architecture career. And so I thought, oh, well, this is so obvious. I'm sure everybody else already knows about this back in the States, right? Because it seems like it makes so much sense. And then from there, I went to UC Berkeley's architecture program and found out that really nobody had ever heard of it. So there was one article in Solar Age. And then just being sort of young and naive enough, my partner and I decided that we would go back and investigate cohousing. And we ended up writing the book that introduced the concept to the United States. So I think there's a couple different things in that. So a lot of it was very personal. I grew up in a variety of strong neighborhoods. So I was really, I was used to the lifestyle as a kid where, you got home from school and you just went out and played in the street, right? There were lots of kids around. You ran in and out of neighbors' houses. I thought that was totally normal. And then I was looking at my life and thinking, how, I'm an architecture school. I plan to work full time. You can't be a part-time architect. And how the hell do I have a family and do that? And so there was a very practical side of just like, I got to create a community. I have this fabulous, big, extensive family, and they are spread out all over. So, there was no, grandparents down the street. There wasn't, and really needed to figure out. So for me, it was a very practical, how do you combine being a working woman and having a family? And I saw this as a real solution. So the other thing, I actually worked as a tenant organizer in the Mission District of San Francisco when I first came out of architecture school. And so I was working in Section 8 housing, and it's like, these are the communities I love. I want to move into here, right? Because the kids would just run out and play in the courtyard. And you don't find that in middle-class housing anymore. So it's like, why am I seeing much stronger sense of community in low-income housing than in new middle-class American housing? So, and then add to that, that we just need a new middle-class American housing model that uses a lot less resources. And that's really what drives me. I mean, that's what keeps me going year after year, is the American middle-class lifestyle is so resource intensive that we are literally going to burn up the world. Mm-hmm. And one of the scariest concepts to me is that the rest of the world looks to the American single-family house, middle-class suburb as what they are striving for. And if the rest of the world gets that, we're dead. It's just that simple.
The American dream.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to kill us all. So, and I really made a very specific decision about not pursuing co-housing as an affordable housing model, but as a market rate housing model, because that's the way most American housing is, market rate housing. And feeling like we can really, there are people out there who can't afford the single family house and want something else. And that's what I saw in co-housing, was something else.
Coming to the US though, I mean, you're staring down the barrel of zoning is not permissive to that, and financing is not permissive to this. The concept isn't there. How do you actually take it from you write a book towards that, you slowly start to chip away at creating these communities? It just seems like such an uphill battle the whole way. And maybe it was a generative, virtuous battle and not actually really torturous. I'm curious about that process.
Well, there's a lot of times, where you feel like I spent a lot of time thinking, I wonder what I'm going to do when I grow up, because there's no way this is going to keep going. I can't sustain myself this way. And then something would show up, and here I have been doing it for over 30 years now. So, really, I think not to be underappreciated is actually the marketing, right? Because, I would say financing is much more of an issue than zoning, but we have over a century, of pretty hardcore propaganda for the single family house. And we are, all of us have that embedded in us. that that's what we're working for, and that's what gives us autonomy. And we have, a whole societal model where that's how you build wealth too, right? So a lot is tied up in the single family house. And that, I think, is really the biggest issue, is getting people to look beyond that. So that's where I really felt like we have to get projects built, because there is nothing more powerful than walking through and meeting people in a co-housing community and say, oh, this is kind of a nice place. Oh, these are nice people. I could see living here. So I think there's a real power in the physical built world of showing an alternative. But yeah, a lot about creating co-housing communities as an education, right? Educating people of what it is, how it works, and it's not a bunch of crazy commune people.
I'm sure there can be, but one of the things that's really impressed me going through co-housing communities is just, wow, that there is a feeling to that. And it's interesting to see there's certainly some similarities, but there can also be a lot of difference within them, and different flavors of what the community wants to become and what they're interested in, like the founding members and how that endures over time. So I think it would be really helpful to paint more of a vivid picture of what is the feel that someone that may not be familiar with co-housing, like what are some of these patterns that you will either layer in from an intentional design perspective, or just that are mainstays to experience going into a community?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we really see living in community and co-housing communities, neighborhoods, is community happens on the pathways, literally, which means you have to run into people, right? And so whether it's a 4-story urban building or townhouses spread out, you've got to run into people, because it's not about meetings. Nobody joins a community for the meetings. The meetings is, you got to keep yourselves organized, but it's the casual interaction that we're really trying to bring out with the design process. So just so one of the simplest way to do that is to get cars, detach the cars from the houses. And so one of the things you'll find very consistently in co-housing design is that the cars are on the edge, often in one parking area, and that from there you walk into the community. And just doing that makes an amazing difference. Because then you open up what is really the most valuable space in any neighborhood, is the space between homes. And that's where the gardens happen, where kids play, where kids are skateboarding or on scooters, and the neighbors are talking about what you're planting. And if you don't have that space, that stuff doesn't happen. So, talk to any kid. A backyard is really boring if you don't have a bunch of other kids there, right? Most kids would much rather be in the front of the house with other kids, right? Or where there are other people going on. And so with a suburban design, we've given over that most valuable outdoor space in a neighborhood to the cars.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can get the cars out of there, things can start to happen. And that's where the spontaneity happens, right? And so I think it's not a scheduled lifestyle, right? It's trying to create a physical environment that really encourages spontaneity and interacting with your neighbors how you want, right? As you come and go through your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you're talking about of like how we've really activated cars and concrete, just not even through suburban design, but through urban design, where you'll see people that, they've got their nice backyard, the family goes and eats a meal in the backyard, and there's no interaction. You've got your 8-foot fence. Meanwhile, like, I don't know, we even put our backyard patios out front where people can walk by and you can say hello on a sidewalk. There's a lot of ways that I think that we can encourage spontaneous interactions amongst people. But what is it that really binds us together in a co-housing community? Is it sharing of amenities? Is it like, what would make a distinct, like, this is where is here? This is here. This is our community.
Right, exactly. And that's a really good question, Neil, because, I think in some ways, like the Congress for New Urbanism really brought back the planning of the 1920s and porches on the street. And so you could have that kind of neighborhood where you do have porches and people actually use them, which means they're big enough to use. but you um, but you still don't have the same sense of community you would have in a co-housing neighborhood. And so I think there's a couple things. One is the intentionality of it. And so one of the terms a lot of people use for co-housing is an intentional neighborhood, right? I'm not trying to convince neighbors that they want. I'm attracting neighbors who want to live in a more intentional neighborhood and see the benefits of working together for their own life as well as the common good. Mm-hmm. So that really choosing that this is the kind of neighborhood I want to live in is a big deal, I think. So that's certainly part of it. The other thing is managing the community together. So co-housing communities tend to end up as a homeowners association, would be the most common. So I want to be clear, co-housing is not a legal definition of a type of ownership. It's an idea about how people can live together in neighborhoods. And it, in theory, could be rentals or cooperative or condos, but in the American financing system, the most co-housing communities are private ownership with a homeowners association, whether they're condos or townhouses. But then you're managing that property together. And for most of us, it is our single largest investment. So we care about that, but managing it in a really collaborative way. And I would argue that really working together takes your relationship in a deeper way, in a really unusual way that we don't generally have with our neighbors. I remember one of my neighbors, she actually moved out and we were talking about, and she was saying, yeah, you just have a relationship with your co-housing neighbors that is really unusual. It's not family. They're not your best friends. And yet you really know each other. Like I live in Nevada City Cohousing. It's a 34 home community. And I could literally walk down the house row and tell you everybody's story. And I'm not best friends with them all, but I care about them all because I know about their story. And I know, their ups and downs, what they're struggling with, what they're happy about, their strengths. And I've worked with them to create a better place for all of us. And so that showing up and being willing to have hard conversations and sort it out and, really push ourselves to allow for as much diversity as we can in thought and different ideas and approaches. And where do we need to agree? Being willing to do that struggle is what I think takes us to a deeper relationship. And what I see, almost all people start, well, I'd love to live in a co-housing community with my friends. And they can't imagine doing it with a bunch of strangers. But most actual built communities are a bunch of strangers. They didn't know each other, right? Because I've actually never seen a community succeed with a group of friends. So
that's interesting. I always find it's really naive to think you're going to build a structure or a community that's going to last maybe a couple hundred years, and you're only thinking about the next 20.
Yes, another good point there. Yeah. So I think, really most co-housing communities come together because you've got some burning souls and it's like, okay, it's this property, it's this timeline, here's our budget. Are you interested? And then build the relationships around that, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but people definitely choosing to live in a more intentional neighborhood, that's the bottom though. So
yeah, can we underscore that too? Of like some of the words that you're using, you're not trying to convince anybody to live in these neighborhoods. You are showcasing what they are, and people are self-selecting in, and that's such an important thing. Especially, what we're doing with regenerative real estate and what you're doing with co-housing, it works whenever we are not trying to convince people. And it's amazing the people that are showing up with their hands raised, being like, I am compelled to this on a heart level, on an emotional level. And it makes sense even as you go up towards what makes sense from a financial reason. And like you're talking about a working career mom and how you could possibly make that work. It's a perverse joke of how our single family suburban dream is supposed to be the pinnacle of living. Meanwhile, it's it's wreaking destruction, and the only people that are really benefiting are the large pharmaceutical companies from just like depression and all kinds of
Yeah.
other things that are coming up. So
Yeah, no, I think the concept of driving your child to play dates, it's like, who the hell thought this up? Was this the ultimate curse to women? It's like, oh yeah, that's just what I need in my life, is to arrange play dates and then have to drive my child across town for those. And that's our social life. So
yeah, well, so I want to get into the nitty gritty here, Katie. Like, what is the current state today? You're saying that there's 180 existing co-housing communities. Is there any rhyme or reason? Do you find that there's a typical size that really works? Is there it's part of the country that these are more congregated in? Like, is this more blue states than red states? Like, where are we at today? And you had talked about financing too. Like, where do we sit today with the ability of a developer or with a community that wanted to go out and create a co-housing community? What kind of ease or barriers are they going to find?
Okay, so we're going to come back to that last question.
Okay.
Because I got a lot on that, but I want to get where you started, which is, so there is a sort of ideal size. I mean, I'm a strong believer. You should try to create community at any size, wherever you are, whatever works for you, right? But when you get to choose, the real sustainable size seems to really work between sort of 20 and 35 homes. And what I see with that is that size allows for a diversity of different household types and different people, and is small enough that I can still know everybody. When you get smaller than that, like my first co-housing community in the United States was Doyle Street Co-housing in Emeryville. It's 12 homes, very urban in the heart of the Bay Area. And it's just, someone's away, someone's dealing with a hardship, you very quickly get down to a really small group, right? And so it's a great community. It's thriving today, going on. Let's see, we moved in 92, so 30 years. But I find a little bit larger gives you a little more room. And so the odds that there is a kid your kid's age, the odds that there's a couple of people I really connect with in a long-term friendship way, and others are neighbors, that people can get caught up in work and not be as available for a year and then come back in, right? It just allows for that greater flexibility. So, and when you get larger, you just don't, it's hard to know everybody, right? There are communities that are 40 units and they're great. If you're getting to 50 or 60 units, I would think about splitting it into 2 neighborhoods. So that is the size question. For where they are, we do seem to follow the liberal world. And I think that really comes down to a comfort level with a non-hierarchical structure. In theory, everybody needs community and wants community, right? I mean, I think as humans, it's part of our basic makeup, as we have survived through millennium by working and living in communities. In today's world, some people just really want a much more hierarchical structure with clear rules, and community will drive them crazy. So, and I think that's one of the really unique things about co-housing as a model is there's not a leader. Co-housing is very specifically not hierarchical. And so being able to be comfortable with that. But the other thing where you see it, so you see more clusters of co-housing communities on the West Coast, in the Northeast, and the Front Range of Colorado.
The Front Range of Colorado.
Right. And that's combined. You can tie that to 2 different things. So one, those tend to be more liberal places, but also they are where the professionals were. So we were based in Northern California. We were talking about co-housing everywhere. There is no co-housing community in Southern California. And I cannot explain that to you because I don't understand Southern California. But there's over 30 in Northern California, right? And that's because I think we were here talking, putting it out there, pushing it forward. The same in the Seattle area. One of the earliest communities was on Bainbridge Island there. So at launch, there were existing communities there. And the Front Range was Jim Leach as a developer. He was doing master plan communities. He was really interested in solar. And the first co-housing community in Colorado called him up and said, would you partner with us to build this community? And he got very intrigued with it. And then actually most of the rest of his development career focused on partnering with co-housing communities.
Why do you think he did that? I mean, what was the intrigue for him?
You might ask Jim that, but I think Jim really sees it. So he eventually moved into a community. For a while, he worked as quite a decade or two as a developer, and then now lives in Silver Sage in Boulder, a senior co-housing community. So I think I think the same things that attract me is looking at a neighborhood that could really take sustainability to the next level. That what you build initially continues to evolve in the way villages did. And Jim is very interested in how working in a community really supports democracy.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
But I think anybody who's looking at sustainability eventually hits upon, I can put a lot of solar panels on this house, but it's the lifestyle that's really driving everything.
Let's sink into that a little bit more. Like expand out the accordion of how this is really oriented towards a sustainable lifestyle.
Yeah, so I think it's just what you can do with 30 households is amazing, right? So my community, we started adding solar panels as soon as we moved in, and we keep adding them. But it's not up to me to figure all that out, because there's the innovative committee and they're thinking about that, right? So I can support them without me having to do all the work that in a single family house, you got to figure out how to get the washing machines repaired. And, I've always wanted to add solar panels. I wonder how you do that, right? How am I going to fit that into my life? So the scale, that 30 home plus or minus scale, is a great scale to work at. Because you can do so much. And you can draw from all of the skills of and interest of all those people who live there. So whether it's
their tools
and their exactly. And so, we moved into Nevada City Cohousing 15 years ago, and we didn't have any EV chargers. And we ad hoc'd something a few years ago, and now we have EV chargers for 12 spots. And that was a couple of my neighbors sitting down, figuring it out, applying for the grants, and getting it done. Right. And so I think one of the really exciting things that when I watch co-housing communities evolve is they do keep evolving. They do keep looking at how do we become more sustainable? What else can we do? How are we going to work our way off fossil fuels? How are we? Because for most neighborhoods, you're kind of like, this is the best we could afford when we were building, and now we're done. And then everybody's on their own after that. So I think it's that social component, right? So every co-housing community, absolutely every single one, is trying to build the most sustainable buildings they can and that they can afford at that moment. But the question is, what keeps you moving forward? Right. And I think that's where having the community aspect really changes it.
So this is what fascinates me in this space is like you have to integrate the hardware and the software. Like the design matters so much that the hardware side can support the scale of sociability and the interactions and the community. But how are you finding as you're evolving your practice, you can really set up communities for success on the software side so that they can govern and evolve themselves and not just end up in complete failure?
Yeah, no, and I think that you really hit it on that. It is both sides. And I have a much greater appreciation now for the software side because you can do a lot with design, but there's a limit, right? And so really it's being very deliberate about process. And so, we are working with the future buyers through the development process. And most co-housing communities in America, it is those future buyers are putting up all the cash, all the equity required to get to a construction loan. So they can get pretty deep in on the finance side. It is not a casual, oh, I'm fed up with you, I'll leave. People, can easily have, $50,000, $100,000 invested before we start construction per household, right? So, so the thing is being really deliberate. So one of the things that probably in that first decade we figured out was that I actually have in my development budgets, I have money for process. And I started telling groups, don't think you're going to save this because I'm going to take it if you don't use it because I'm going to pay the price. So I don't care how you use it, but you need to use this $20,000 or $30,000 in your development budget to tune up your process. So bring in people, work with people, try different things, but really being deliberate about how we work together, how we work effectively together, how we facilitate meetings, how we delegate to committees. And so when you join a co-housing community, everybody's expected to participate. And generally that includes participating on a committee for one thing or another. And then just really being active and thinking about, is this working? When is it not working? How can we work it better? Because, relationships, people are all complicated. We're not all smooth sailing. We have our ups and downs. But that is a big part of the sort of co-housing development world, is that there are process consultants that specialize in working with communities. I'm pushing the communities that I'm working with on budgets to find people to work with in the process and be more deliberate. And frankly, every homeowners association in America should be doing that. Right? Because this is the fallacy of homeowners associations, is that especially condos, this idea that you're going to sell condos to a bunch of people who are often in the American model. I buy a condo because I don't want to do yard maintenance, but we have no other shared values, right? There is no vision statement in most condos. So, but in co-housing communities, they do have a vision statement. They do know why they're working together, and they have a much clearer idea why it's worth working together, because they can do more together than they could alone.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I had to just chuckle to myself working with condo associations, and it seems like what they're really good at is what day of the week you need to cut your lawn, what color paint you're going to paint your house, and who's going to do the maintenance, and that's about it. And I go back to even my parents, where growing up, my dad would always say, what makes a good neighbor? An 8-foot fence in between.
Right.
And I'm sure he's going to listen to this. I'm sorry for picking you out, Dad. But yeah, I mean, this is a whole new orientation to how we do create inclusive, thriving, participatory-based communities, rather than just signing away our agency and thinking that a small group of people is going to have our best interest at heart. And the founding documents that this neighborhood has is going to be the end-all be-all for as long as the neighborhood survives.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a crazy concept, right? So, you got to have, why are we working together? And it's interesting because I think, in my own community, whenever we would hit a tough spot and it's like, oh, we can't seem to find agreement on this, we would just say, well, we need more parties. That's the fun part. And so really emphasizing on what brings us together. And out of that, then we can tackle the hard stuff better, right? So I think that's
just
really
a party every weekend.
Yeah, no, it's and it is, I think really, it's truly amazing. The feeling that, and it's hard for people to imagine this, but anybody who's living in co-housing would totally relate to what I'm saying here, is that my best friends are not living in my community. The level of trust I have on my community mates is over the top. I never lock my door. We have a little, email thread that goes, and my neighbor A couple of weeks ago, he sent out an email. It's like, I'm really dying for some chips. Anybody got some chips? And I said, doors open, they're in the bottom cupboard. So, I mean, it's just, there aren't very many neighborhoods who would do that. And I remember, my daughter is now grown, but I remember the first time, she was, I don't know, 6 or 7, and she didn't want to go. I had to go grocery shopping. She didn't want to go with me. And I said, okay, nobody's home. Yeah, you can stay home. Here's what you need to know, Jesse. If you need anything, and I did mean anything, you can go to any one of these 11 neighbors around us, and they'll be there for you. And I felt as a mom, I mean, that's a big deal to feel that in your heart, that like, I know any of these neighbors would step in there and do what needed to be done, whatever she was hitting up against. Maybe she just needed something to eat, or maybe there was an emergency, right? Mm. So to live in a neighborhood where you feel that way is a pretty amazing thing. And it definitely makes you feel a lot less sort of, scared of the world.
Yeah. I mean, anybody that listening that's remotely in my demographic of having a 6-year-old at home and realizing, not only do we have the child rearing responsibility that is permanently on us, but if something breaks and I don't know how to fix it, I don't know who to call. I probably don't have the tool for it. So I got to go buy another tool. If I get sick and my kid is just bouncing off the walls and wants to go play, that's the last thing that I want to do is go set up a play date for that. And
yeah, so you know what my neighbor did? So let me just show you the contrast here. So my neighbor Mags, last week, she got hit by a really bad flu. So they have 2 kids. And Stu was away at a conference. The 8-year-old wasn't sick. The 5-year-old was sick, and Mags was really sick. So she just sent out an email to the community. Here's what's happening at our house. If anybody could get Ramon outside, that would be really helpful. Ramon's the 8-year-old, right? Sure enough, no problem. People showed up. 1 email out to your neighbors. So, and this is, I mean, I don't understand how people raise kids outside of communities. I think it's zonkers. I mean, it's one thing if you're surrounded by extended family. Yeah. But what you just hit on, I think, is such an unrealistic expectation for families that.
Oh, it's insane.
Yeah. And so.
Even like layer in some of these other desires of how you want to live. Like, let's say you want to create a garden. I know there's a lot of us that, come February, March, you get a lot going on in your professional life. And you're like, I need to start thinking about what to do with the beds. And maybe you wake up and your free time comes in May and June. You're like, oh man, I wasn't able to actually do that. You've missed a whole growing season because of the way that design has dictated how we interact. And we have no idea that we're living in this world that we design, but we're like throwing up our hands saying, this is just the way that it is. We completely forgot that we did this ourselves.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other one is like chickens, right? I mean, if you have chickens, it's really hard to leave. But I never had that problem. We had chickens. Oh, you're on it this week. Can you cover me next week? Because I'm going to be gone. No problem, right? So there's just so many things that work so much better on a community level.
Katie, how do we take this out to the world? Like, what's the barriers that we're running up against? What do you think needs to happen? Where are the big dominoes that we need to really push on so that it'll have a cascade effect going forward?
Yeah, well, I think, as I mentioned, I've been really focused on getting communities built and I push the communities to really try. What happens is, most people who move into co-housing, they're not development professionals. They get through the development process and it's like, phew, okay, done with that. Now I just want to live here. Mm-hmm. And they go quiet, right? And so we do have a national nonprofit, the Cohousing Association, cohousing.org, and they have the best directory. So if you want to know where co-housing communities are, you go to cohousing.org. And that's really been a critical organization. They're the ones who put on the conferences, both virtual and in person, hold the directory. Sort of that's where the A lot of information is exchanged there. And so, my push to the association and to communities is we have to be more public. Can you post more on social media about how good it is to live in co-housing? And we do over the last couple of years, a little slowed down during COVID, but now back there's a National Co-Housing Open House Day in April, where we really encourage communities to just do an open house, invite people to come and see it. Because I am a real believer that seeing is believing. And, I have had literally thousands and thousands of people tell me this will never work. And it's like, well, come on over. Let me show you it working. So I really think that's one thing. But I think the other thing is what I see, and kind of how I've refocused sort of part of my work, is that because people just want to live in the community, they're not the ones taking it forward. Communities have a few burning souls that really plug into the National Association, but most people don't. Most people are just living their lives in community and enjoying it, which is what they should be able to do. But it's the professionals who are take the lessons learned forward and develop, just like, let's just take a site search, right? If you're a developer and you're looking for properties, and you're working in a certain region, the first one is a lot of work. But over time, you understand the zoning better, you build relationships better, brokers get to know you. And an established developer gets calls from brokers on sites all the time. Right? So co-housing groups don't get that because they're a one-off project. And so I think it's the professionals that really develop the relationships with banks, get the words out there. So most of my work is working with individual co-housing groups as a development consultant, bringing the best practices forward of like, here, this is how you want to do that. This is, and helping them adapt the best practices for their specific situation. But the other thing I've started is a program called the 500 Communities Program. And it's a year-long training. And my goal is to share the best practices and help professionals get more involved in community development and to take it forward, right? And because I know what's worked getting to this point. I don't know what's going to work in 20 years, right? But I think what I want both my client groups and professionals to start from the best practices. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. Let's start here and get it better instead of you reinventing and going through all the hard shit I already went through, right? And then the other thing that the 500 Communities Program does is, and it's a real mixture, right? So there's developers, there's project managers, there's a whole marketing and sales process. So helping people figure out what their business model is, right? Mm-hmm. There's the big ideas, and then how do you really implement this? Because guess what? Nobody's going to pay you. Yes, I agree that needs to be done, but nobody's going to pay you for that. So I'm very interested in how do you create sustainable business models. This needs to be something that can actually sustain a professional. And so that's the other part of the 500 Communities Program. So now I have a group of affiliates that have been through the program. And we meet monthly and share ideas, support each other, so that there's this larger group of professionals that are really looking at the best of practices and what can we learn from that? How do we take that forward? So what, my goal is I would love to see more developers. They don't have to do only co-housing. But that look at co-housing as one of the products that they're involved in. And more professionals that can help. Like the way I work now is I can work with an architect who's never done co-housing. I can work with a developer who's never done co-housing, and I can bring that piece if they know their business in their region, right? So we can plug that in. But that's what I would say that's my disappointment at this point is that there aren't more developers initiating co-housing communities. That is really still up to the groups. No.
What's your theory on that? Why not?
Well, every single developer, and I worked as a developer. I just never did traditional development, so maybe I don't have that comparison. But they all take every opportunity to tell me that they can make more money for less time by not involving future residents. So I think, and part of it, when I hear some stories, I was like, well, why did you do it that way? That would drive me crazy. So I think introducing this idea that you can really mitigate the risk of doing something different by bringing the buyers in and their skin in the game, that they're putting money in this deal, and that you can discipline that process in a way that it doesn't take endless time.
I'm like having a couple different like parallel downloads all at the same time, because we focus a lot on who is the demand and what are they really looking for. And I've gone blue in the face talking with appraisers, trying to tell them about, you're not valuing the sustainable feature because you don't see it within other comps. So you don't think that there is a demand there. Ultimately, that's what they're looking for. And I'm like, it's actually a supply problem. There is not enough supply for the demand. And even if there's latent demand because they don't know that it exists. So now it's a marketing problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree.
What about the finance? Where does that stand? Do you think that there's a barrier for developers from getting the capital to build these kind of projects?
No, because the package that I'm taking for a construction loan is 75% pre-sold, with buyers with 10 to 20% in the deal being spent on actual cost. And if I can package that with a good, strong developer who can provide a guarantee, we've got an unbeatable financing structure.
Yeah.
And that's what I think, what I figured out pretty early on was we need to be able to prove we've got buyers. And so that's where I went directly, was like, we could talk about this all day long. We need real buyers that can really afford it and have skin in the game.
So the buyers are actually coming up with the equity requirements that the developer needs. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I think that's actually the most radical and hardest thing, because I'm talking to people, most of the people that hire me for co-housing groups, they just want to live in co-housing. They don't want to become developers.
Right.
This is not what they want to do with their lives, but they're forced to become developers or co-developers because nobody else is building it.
Mm-hmm.
So the model I'd really like to aim for is that developers are ready to partner with co-housing groups or could actually initiate projects, because they're much better at site search than a co-housing group typically is. And that the group doesn't have to come up with quite as much money. So I'm a real believer of skin in the game. I don't believe anything you say if you don't have skin in the game. But, I think 10% is a lot. And especially if we want to get younger households, it's a real stretch for younger households. You might be able to afford the mortgage, but coming up with cash up front is really hard. So
yeah, I'd love to take that off ramp around accessibility as well. Of like, I'm sure there's innovation that you're starting to see around how to create more affordable homes within these communities, and where do you see the connection between affordability and co-housing?
Yeah, well, there's a huge discussion in the co-housing world about affordability. And the problem, it really it's a structural issue, which is we don't tax ourselves enough as a society. There's so little money for affordable housing. And most affordable housing today is in tax credits and light tech projects, and that's become a big business.
Mm-hmm.
Every single co-housing community in the country, if there was some source of funding, would love to have, 3 to 5 homes that are deed restricted, long-term affordable, but they need subsidies to help them do that. And that subsidy basically doesn't exist. That is not the way the affordable housing world has evolved. So I think that I think I can say that pretty across the board, if every single co-housing community would love to be more economically diverse than they are able to, because there isn't financing to help with that.
Are you seeing any interest from combining a land trust model into co-housing? Is that happening?
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting you bring that up. So we had the first in-person national conference since COVID just happened in Madison, Wisconsin in August. And they have a really strong community land trust there. It kind of blew my mind how much they were able to do. So so that is something that I've been renewed interest from me is like, and that's the problem is, do you have a community land trust in your area that's got any money, right? It's always the question, where's the money for subsidy come from? Because the legal structure doesn't make a difference on the cost. There has to be some subsidy to bring it down below market cost. And so, but yeah, I think that's the really interesting idea is if you've got a land trust that could own or manage a couple of units within the community and then help find the buyers in deed restricted units to bring in some money to subsidize those.
Yeah, and that money piece, it's like this is what really lights me up is how can the wider community, not just the co-housing community, support these kinds of projects? How do we align our community money so that it can flourish within creating inclusive community rather than siloing real estate projects that typically go towards either institutions or institutional money or high net worth individuals, and they are getting the returns, and that money just flows right out of the community.
Yeah.
So what is a way in which and maybe it's going to take a little bit longer if you're going in $500 or $2,000 chunks, but man, wouldn't it be great if you could have structures of community-based financing to really get either community land trusts off the ground or more community co-housing projects off the ground?
Right. And so I've got client groups that are, I mean, the problem, we're often looking at internal, financing. Could we underwrite the cost of a couple of units? The problem is my co-housing buyers is we're going to raise the price of your house to underwrite the cost of this house. And I've just pushed a few people out with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I do think it's I think we actually have the opportunity to have a lot of that discussion in co-housing communities, and particularly as we're facing this, huge wealth transfer between boomers and the next generation. So one of the things I'm trying to talk about more is, there's a long history of parents helping kids buy into the housing market. There's an increasing number of people not having kids. What if we disconnect the blood? What if it doesn't have to be a blood connection, right? How can I help the next generation buy in? And I don't have to be related to that person, right? There's a lot of different, really interesting, creative things happening that aren't sort of big scale. But, just as an example, I could, when the pandemic hit, in the earlier recession in 2009, there were communities all across the country that set up hardship funds with their own donations. When we're not going to let this take one of ours. If there's somebody needs help, we can help them. And so, I think there were a few foreclosures, but very few in co-housing, and all sorts of stories of how to support a family getting through a hard time. There was one story I heard about where a guy living in a community decided to go back to graduate school, and he was really stretched by the HOA dues. Nobody ever knew what, but this check showed up in his mailbox every month for the next 2 years.
Wow, that's incredible.
So, and I think part of that is it's just much easier to do when you have relationships with people. Right. It's like I talk to people all the time, and people, people to write a check for someone they don't know is a lot harder than like, oh my God, well, Susan, well, we don't want her to have to move out. How can we help her? That personal relationship makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So, but the other thing, because I think there's another piece, and this kind of circles back to where we are in the housing market. One of the biggest problems with the housing market today, in my humble opinion, is almost nobody is building smaller infill condominium developments. And the condo thing has gotten a really bad rap because the attorneys got hold of it. It's a liability issue. Every single town, every single city in America needs small infill condo home ownership, not just rentals. Because what you have is most of the American housing market is single family house suburbs or the 3-story skinny townhouse, but a single family house, or rentals. And we've almost eliminated the in between, just really in my during my career.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we don't have the missing middle, because nobody's building small infill condos. And go to Europe. I mean, Northern Europe is full of more urban homeownership opportunities than we have in the US. So much to my surprise, co-housing now is one of the only sources of new small homeownership homes that you could buy.
That's incredible that the insurance and legal industries can bring small infill condos to its knees.
Yeah, I mean, it's total. I've watched it spread across America.
Yeah, if people aren't familiar, as you're listening to this, this is a phenomenon that has boomed where communities are rallied by an attorney, typically an ambulance chasing type of attorney, over potential for water intrusion. I've even heard of potential for noise intrusion, and all kinds of like potential structural defects. And what they're essentially doing is they're going after the insurance money that a developer has to carry for 10 years is the window of liability on a project. And they know that they can easily get that pot of money, and it likely not going to a trial, because the insurance companies know they should just pay it rather than fight it. So that's a little bit of information. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I thought
I could go on and on, but I did. You did a nice summary. Yeah. No, and exactly. And so, but circling back, so one of the interesting things, so just using my community here in Nevada City as an example, nobody else is building small homes. And so over time, we are actually the best deal in town because we have small 2-bedrooms, and it's almost impossible to find a small 2-bedroom you could buy in Nevada City outside of co-housing. So whereas I was kind of like, we're not really going to be the affordable housing option, it turns out that we have been, just because co-housing communities are always including some small homes, right? I mean, we're under the same challenges of any developer. Housing budgets are determined by the amount of square feet you can sell on a project.
Right. But this is the thing that I've seen, because I've lived in progressive West Coast cities where they have allowed for more density, especially for that missing middle. So it's pushed the land prices higher, because now people can theoretically build more densely. And so it's almost like you've priced out or the ability to build smaller because the land is going to cost more. Mm-hmm. So it's this you're forever chasing, how do we build small?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a really, I fully understand why there are almost no developers focused on first-time buyers. Mm. Because, and the ones that are in a suburban single-family house model, because I'm only one house out, and then interest rates go up, I can change my model. I'm not too far out. But it's really hurting cities.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So let's see. I'm very intrigued in your 500 communities program, and I think we get a lot of real estate professionals that listen to this show. And I mean, I would love to go through that myself, because I think that's there's so much overlap with what we do with Latitude. But how about for the people that are listening that are compelled to live in co-housing? What do you think that the cohousing.org is the place to go, as if we wanted to orient them towards an action that they can take?
Yeah, that's the best place to go, because you will find almost all co-housing communities are listed there. So you can see what's available in any given region of the country, what forming communities there are versus existing communities. One of the things that's a real challenge is, you need a bit of a stroke of luck to be able to buy into an existing community. because they often sell just within their own networks and they're never really posted. But there are, but that is cohousing.org is the place. It also, just to give a little plug to them, they've just started a new program called the Cohousing Institute, where they're going to organize better a lot of virtual sessions, and we'll be having a monthly session as an introduction to cohousing. So as a place to kind of get a feel for what's going on, that's the landing pad, is cohousing.org.
Oh, wow.
And who's out there? Are there communities in your area? And depending on people's flexibility, I find it a lot when people are looking at retirement that they'll actually do the whole co-housing tour up and down the West Coast or the East Coast and see what's out there, because they are now more flexible where they can land. So yeah, I think that's the best place to plug in. And there's my book is Creating Cohousing as a good resource. But it's that the association is really the landing pad for that.
What's next for you, Katie? Are you staying in your lane, or are you trying to get traction on a whole new term and go for round two?
Well, I would say, I raised my daughter in cohousing, and I think it's a fabulous way to raise kids. I just don't how the hell are you doing it, Neil, out there on your own? I just don't get it. And so that's really, I would say, is one thing is I'm really dedicated to trying to get this out to the next generations, because I just think it's a much saner way to live. And then we'll be recruiting for the 500 communities. So starting in we'll be doing a bunch of webinars about the program in February, March, and taking applications in June. And then the next program starts in September. So that's a big part of my early part of 2023 is trying to push that out there. It is, it's the core of the program is I get to be selective. I think about this like the Harvard of cohousing development. Not everybody gets in.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, this is not, I'm looking for a few really good people who have a chance of actually succeeding. And I'm pretty dedicated to not training more people where there isn't a market. We got to grow the market, right? And so I don't need 5 people in Northern California when we don't have enough projects to support 5 people, right? But I'm very dedicated, really hoping to help support this next generation in starting new communities as professionals, and the ones that will take it forward.
Okay, so if you're in Oklahoma, you're a shoo-in here.
Yeah, actually,
there is some really good work going on in Oklahoma. I don't want to put
and actually, the second Oklahoma co-housing community is just finishing construction.
Oh, there you go.
In Tulsa. So yeah, but yeah, more professionals. And I think one of the things I'd really, I had a development company and all we did was co-housing. And I don't think you need to do it that way. I mean, my goal with the 500 communities program is you don't have to dedicate yourself to co-housing. You just have to work it into your mix, right? So when you see opportunities as a professional, you know where to go with it and have some possibilities there. And I think one of my most successful clients, my shout out here is Shelley Parks, who is on the verge any day moving into Skagit Commons in Anacortes. But she came into the 500 Communities program with a background in sales, and particularly for senior housing, and has now just brought really fabulous skills and expertise to co-housing communities across the country about, a real live sales program and how it really works. And instead of a bunch of introverts trying to figure it out, not really knowing how to do it. So I think, it's developers, it's project managers, it's architects, but there is this whole side of marketing and sales that if we're up against the single family house industry, we need to get really good at.
Yeah.
So,
well, Katie, this has been an amazing conversation. It's so interesting for me to see how you can really stick at something and snowball it and develop it. And so it's just really inspiring to see where you've come with co-housing and knowing that it's continuing to pick up momentum. And I really applaud your efforts, because I know it can't be easy, but like you say, how are people doing it not raising kids in co-housing? And that really gives me a lot to think on a personal and a professional level. So thank you for taking the time to come on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows? Maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.